I'm really excited to have it with me today, Meni Tsambouniaris. Meni's been working in cultural competency and education care services for years and years, and you're currently working with an organisation called Diversity Kids, is that right?
Correct, Lisa. Yes, spot on. Love the way you pronounce my surname. It's spot on. Perfect. Thank you.
It's one of those things that's very hard, but if I'm going to be culturally competent, it's the least I can do.
Absolutely.
Tell us a bit about Diversity Kids. What's Diversity Kids?
Yeah, Diversity Kids, I'm co-founder and co-manager of Diversity Kids, and we set it up a few years ago, Lisa. And what we do is we run all sorts of inclusion programs to make sure that children's services have access to programs that will help ensure that all their children are included. You know, we have ethnic workers on board, speech pathologists on board, behaviour specialists, special ed consultants. So it's a pool of professionals that services can tap into and help all children become included. But before that, I think like you, lived and breathed inclusion through many of the Commonwealth inclusion support programs. You're one of the people I know that remembers and knows what I'm talking about when I say that I managed a subs program a long time ago.
I'm feeling very old now.
That was decades ago. And I've also had, I was very, very privileged to deliver the New South Wales bicultural support program for many years. And I think I'm an author, a trainer, a consultant, and I love developing resources around cultural inclusion. So that's me in a nutshell.
And she does it really well too.
Thank you.
So what do you think that cultural competency is in a family daycare setting?
I love that question. My favourite question. And cultural competence, it's that term that gets thrown around so often, doesn't it, Lisa? But how many of us actually really think about it, what it is, and reflect on whether we're doing it and how we actually do it? Cultural competence, it's referred to in the frameworks quite a lot. And in the early years learning framework, I've actually pulled up the description so that I could let you know. It's described in the early years learning framework as much more than an awareness of cultural differences. It's the ability to understand, to communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. And I love that. But I have another layer to cultural competence that I'd like to add to that. Cultural competence for me in family daycare means that as educators, as family daycare educators, you recognise that all children are cultural beings. They come to your family daycare settings with a very strong cultural identity. Sometimes you might not even realise that they have these strong cultural identities, but they are informed in lots of different ways through their child rearing practices, for example, the knowledge. Sometimes they come out with things and you think, oh, that's probably cultural. Some of their values, probably the most obvious things in family daycare in children's services would be things like attitude to play. A lot of that is cultural. Things like sleeping arrangements, toileting, feeding, and the other obvious things, the celebrations and the cultures and the festivals that we celebrate with the children. So cultural competence to me is recognising all that you have these cultural beings and embracing that and nurturing it and actually using that and putting it into practice in your family daycare settings. So you're creating that bridge, that cultural bridge, and bringing it into your family daycare environment. You're learning about the families and the cultures and the children and the way they do things, and you're communicating and getting all that knowledge and using it in practice. That is, for me, cultural competence. A lot of people, Lisa, when they think about cultural competence, what they think is, okay, it's things like this. It's my resources, the cultural resources. You know, we invite our Aboriginal elders to come in and support us with our rap or acknowledgement of country. You know, they play the didgeridoo. We translate for our families that don't understand English. We bring in bilingual educators when the children, you know, struggling with language. We celebrate all those festivals. Spot on. That is one part of cultural competence, but there's another part. See, this part that I just described is the visible part. It's the tangible things that we see, that we do. There's another part, goes back to what I was talking about earlier, and it's got to do with our knowledge. It's got to do with our attitudes towards diversity and what we do with that. You know, the communicating, the cross-cultural communications, the building relationships with the called children and families. So pulling it all together, the two aspects that I've just described, pulling it together, that's cultural competence for me. And one, because I can go on and on if you like about cultural competence, but one last thing that I wanted to highlight about cultural competence, people think it's a destination. It's somewhere that you go to, that you get to, and it's not. I like to think of it as a journey, an ongoing reflection journey that you do every day. Cultural competence differs from person to person. Your cultural experience, Lisa, will be very different to mine. It differs from situation to situation, in family daycare setting from family daycare setting, and it differs from opportunity to opportunity. That's the key word, you know, in cultural competence, opportunity. You grab the cultural opportunities that come your way and you learn from it and you grow from it and you implement and you put these things into practice. So that's my take on cultural competence.
Look, I don't think that it's something that anyone ever actually becomes culturally competent. It's not like, okay, I've got this now and I'm really culturally competent, because what happens, you meet someone from a different culture and it hits against all of your prejudice and all of the views that you've been brought up with, and suddenly you go, oh, okay, I've just got to work out what's happening here.
Absolutely. Like, I've been in this field for decades, and I can say that I learned something new from the kiddies, from, about cultures every day. Just recently, I knew it. There was something in the back of my mind that I had to research. I had to find out a little bit more. The language Bengali. I started consulting with some of our educators and discovered that Bengali is spoken in Bangladesh, but it's also spoken in India from people living in Bengal. And although the dialect is the same, it's similar, it's actually quite different. And when you're talking about these two different countries, you're also talking about different religions. So it's really important to ask these questions and to find out things, especially when you're working with children and families.
One of the things that is really important about cultural competence is, having respect for cultural differences. How can a family daycare educator help teach children to respect, and understand cultural differences?
That's a really important question, Lisa. And as family daycare educators, we're in a position to be able to do that from a very early age, to teach all those important things and to nurture them and instill them in children. Things like an appreciation of diversity, of different cultures, of respect, of things like kindness, even things like, anti-bias and social justice. So we're in a really good position as family daycare educators to do that. We have this really lovely quote from Diversity Kids, and I brought a copy to show you today. I think it summarizes all in a nutshell. Inclusive practice in early childhood creates future inclusive citizens and children, right? So, we live and breathe diversity and multiculturalism in Australia. Did you know that 1 in 4 of us were born overseas? 200 different languages spoken. So what happens? These are the children and the families that end up in our family daycare settings. So we need to start educating children about the cultures that are out there, but also, making children in our family daycare environments feel good about their cultures. And one of the things that I've noticed about doing this sort of cultural practice in family daycare in any children's service type, every single time without fail, there's so many wonderful things going on, but the two that stand out for me, Lisa, are children from those particular cultural backgrounds. They experience this cultural self-esteem, this pride, cultural safety, sense of belonging. So I've witnessed it, and now I actually look for it whenever we go into children's services, and we take bilingual workers with us, or we immerse them in bilingual or cultural programs, or whatever we do, an incursion. The children from those particular cultural backgrounds, their faces light up. Their eyes are just, and they're looking around at their peers and they're going, is this really happening? So it makes them feel pretty special. And a lot of the time, educators actually come out and tell us, never seen interaction like that before, that they're actually engaged. And that speaks volumes. And then the other beautiful thing that's happening is all other children, if you're doing inclusion well, cultural inclusion well, all the other children are learning something too. And the message is that
the best way of kind of teaching children about other cultures. Yeah.
What's the best way of teaching? Is that what you asked?
Yeah.
Resources for me is the number one. We have to be very careful in the resources that we select. And I like to share with services that when you're using resources with children, it's really important that, whether they're books, whether they're posters, whether they're dolls, the children need to be able to look at these resources and see mirrors in them so that they can relate, and it makes them feel good because it represents them, who they are. But these resources also need to be windows. So when you open the windows, they get the opportunity to look out and see what's going on in their world. The best way to introduce these sorts of programs is by doing, by experiencing, by actually consulting with the children, by bringing in the families and working with them, getting them to share ideas and cultural practices, and also consulting with the community and getting people to come in and share their cultures. But I think the key word for me when it comes to cultural inclusion and doing it best is embedding cultural perspectives. And by that, I mean building them in, having them there everywhere, every day, and not even making a big deal about it, Lisa. Like, you're doing some paper folding and you don't have to highlight, this is a craft that we do in Japan. Kids are doing it. Someone might come out and say, oh, my mum does this at home, and there's your opportunity to have that conversation. Embedding is also, I like to think of embedding as a seamless type of approach. So when you're introducing culture in your services, it should be flowing. It's seamless. It's from child to child, from room to room, from day to day. It's there every day, everywhere. Okay. That's the way I would deliver cultural programs. I just lost it there.
I think that's good because it's doing it in a way that isn't kind of tokenistic, and it's saying, if we're learning about gardening, for example, then we can look at what's important in a range of different countries, how they garden, why they garden, what crops they might grow. Or we could also look at how do the original owners of Australia, Aboriginal people, what do they believe about the land that we're gardening on?
And it's not just about, when I talk about embedding culture, it's not just about introducing cultural activities through art and craft, through cooking, say, or stories or whatever. That's one side of it, but you're spot on, Lisa. Embedding is also about taking any opportunity, any child's interests, and trying to look at it through a cultural lens. And a lot of people think that's so hard. It's just extra work for me, but it's not, because you can look at everything through a cultural lens. And like you said, that example that you gave is perfect. Another one would be, someone's mum might have had a baby. So you use that opportunity to look at it through a cultural lens and start talking about, maybe invite mum in with a baby, talk about the different ways we say baby. How do you say baby in your language? And there's so many resources and visuals out there about babies from around the world. So yeah, that's a way to do it. You don't want to be tokenistic.
Okay, one of the things that I'm really aware of is that a huge number of our family daycare educators come from a culture that isn't the dominant Australian culture. Should they introduce their own culture to the children they're minding?
I think that's a really, really fantastic idea. And I would say 100% yes. Because just the same way that, we like to include the children's cultures in our program, I'm sure the children and the families love to learn about our cultures too as educators. And I think it's part of the cultural embedding, and it's part of our cultural competence journey. I don't know whether many educators actually think about it along this line, Lisa, but when you're on your cultural competence journey and you're reflecting on that, what you're doing, you do realise that you're actually taking the children on your cultural competence journey with you too. So it's about their cultural competence too. So sharing your culture it's a great idea. I'd like to share some examples with you of some services and people that have done it really well, sharing their culture. There was a particular service that just embarked on their cultural competence journey, and they thought, how are we going to do this as a team? And what better place to start than through those staff profiles that they put in the entrance area? I know this is a long daycare example, but it's transferable to family daycare. So what they thought was they put the photo up of themselves, a little blurb about their cultural background and what's important to them from their culture, the languages that they speak, and their cultural background. So in my case, it would be I'd have an Australian and a Greek flag. I speak English and Greek. And one of the most important things to me about my culture is Easter, celebrating Easter. I've done that as a child, and now I'm doing it with my children and family. So it's an ongoing, I'm going to continue that forever because it's very important to me. What do you think happened when the educators started reading about one another? There was all this conversation going on and communication and sharing of experiences and knowledge and, exchange. And then they took that information and built it into the resources and the programming with the children. So the same thing was going on with the children. They started listening to, information about their educators and their cultures, and they started sharing things about what goes on for them at home. And surprise, surprise, the same thing was going on with the families. So once the families read all this information, they started imparting with information about their cultural backgrounds and what was important to them. And you see what happened there? By sharing that cultural information about themselves, they opened up the opportunity for the cultural competence journey throughout the whole service. And they didn't even have to go outside the service. The resources were right there in their environment.
That's a wonderful example, but we know that, some parts of Australia are deeply racist and that educators can face cultural incompetence. What would you suggest to educators if they do face, racism in their work? Whether it be from families or from coordinators or even from children, because we know children can be racist as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, that does still go on, Lisa. I'm hoping not as much as in the past, but it does still happen. And what's cultural incompetence? It's exactly the opposite to cultural competence. An example of a culturally incompetent educator to me would be someone that thinks, we don't need these cultural programs. These children are here in Australia now. We do things a particular way. They're not open to change or doing things differently because their way is the way, they think. And sometimes there is evidence of discrimination happening. So if you were one of those educators that experienced that, there are things you could do. I wouldn't walk away from that. You need to act on that. And sometimes you'd also be experiencing racism, as you mentioned, or discrimination in your workplace as an educator, either as an educator or you see it in the playground with the children being discriminatory. I want to share this story with you about what happened last year during the pandemic with children and discrimination on the playground. We had services contacting us and asking things like, oh my goodness, what do we do? Children are excluding other children in the playground, using things like, I don't want to play with you, you have the Chinese flu, or I don't want to play with that doll, that's got skin colour like yours, so you can play with that. So my point here, Lisa, is just if you experience that with a child and you saw that happening in the playground, you would act. As an educator, you would act. You would you take the child that showed the discriminatory behaviour and talk to them about that it's not on. What we do, the way we speak to our friend, it hurts their feeling. You'd also check in on the child that experienced the discrimination and make sure they were okay. And as an educator, you would program along that stuff that we were talking about earlier, diversity and respect and kindness and speaking up for your friends that, experience something like discrimination or bias. So just the same way you would act when it happens to a child, you would act when it happens to an adult too, especially to you, because if you don't do anything, you're allowing it to happen. That cycle will continue to happen. I think the message that you also give is that it's okay, it can keep happening, and it's not. I'm the sort of person that looks at challenges and negative things like that and turns them upside down and looks at them as opportunities. So it would be an opportunity for an educator to grow, to learn, to do new things.
And to help somebody else become culturally competent.
Absolutely. So what would you do, Lisa?
Part of cultural, like a really important part of cultural competency is examining your own views for racism and prejudice. Yes. And so by saying to someone, hey, that was actually racist, then it can help people understand what that feels like.
And you could, if you felt strong enough about it, you could take it to your management so they, are aware of it. But I would probably take it to a team meeting level and talk about what you've observed, what you've experienced, what you're feeling, and maybe suggest that cultural competence journey that they all need to come on board and move forward, because you know what, Lisa, there's no room for racism in early childhood, whether it's to do with children or educators, no room for it in early childhood.
For sure. So what would doing culture well in family daycare look like for you? Let's finish off with that one, what, a service that was really doing it well, what would you expect to see? An educator that was really doing it well.
Okay, I call it rocking cultural inclusion in family daycare, rocking it. Yeah. So, a family daycare educator that rocks inclusion is someone that recognises the barriers that these children and families have. And in most cases, for called children and families I'm talking about now, the barriers are language. They don't speak English, so they're not able to participate fully, like maybe all the other children are. And culturally, it's a little bit different, the environment, right? So a family daycare educator rocking inclusion would work out what those barriers are and do whatever they could do to break down these barriers, to remove them, so that all the children are participating equally. They'd be rocking cultural inclusion too if they did everything I spoke about earlier, embedding cultural practices every day, everywhere, seamless, looking at everything through that cultural lens, and being able to adapt it. But another really important thing, Lisa, that I've forgotten to actually weave throughout this chat is someone who rocks cultural inclusion reflects on what they do every day and thinks about, okay, by me doing this, programming along these lines, who is benefiting? Who am I advantaging? Is somebody missing out? Should I be doing things differently? So in a nutshell, family daycare educators who rock inclusion are those that educate all children about different cultures, but at the same time, all children in their family daycare environments feel like they're at home and culturally safe.
That's wonderful. Meni, if people wanted to talk to you about what you could do for their service, what's your web address?
We're at www.diversitykids.com.au, and please join us. We'd love to work with you.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure everyone's learned a lot from that.
Thank you for having me, Lisa. Thank you.